everybody deserves to have a place to live. Everybody deserves to have food to eat. Everybody deserves to have the medications they need, and everybody deserves to have clothes on their back. And we are failing at all four of those things for the lowest income Ontarians right now.
Hello, OneSunnyDay.com podcast. Today my guest is Andrew Drummond. He is running in the Ontario election for the Burlington seat under the NDP. Hello, Andrew, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
What we'll do, I like going through the platforms of the various parties, and I will say the NDP gave me a lot to read.
We have a habit of doing that and having a very lengthy and well thought out plan to give you lots of things to talk about today, I imagine.
Challenged only by the Federal Green Party, which is like encyclopedic in nature. But I tried to summarize out parts of the platform that are interesting. And as we go through it, if there's anything that you'd like to know, please do. But first I'll ask, so what got you into this mess? Why are you running?
Perfectly bluntly, 4 years ago, I got into this. I'd been away from the party for a while. I mean, I've had NDP values and been a part of the party for a long time, but I hadn't been active for a while. And coming up on the 2018 election, I wanted to get more involved, and it turned out they didn't have a candidate here, and that opportunity was available, and I kind of took it last minute and did what I could with it. It was, I don't even know how to put it. It was something that I did just to help out the team and do what I could do 4 years ago, and then it went really well, and to be a little bit blunt, I was pretty good at it. So I've taken the last 4 years to really get ready for this run, for this 4-week stretch we're about to come up on here. And we've built the team that we need here in Burlington, and we've raised the money that we need here in Burlington, because I'm pretty sure if I do this properly that I can win this seat.
Yeah, you were very close. How many votes did you miss by?
It was 11 percentage points.
Very impressive, considering you were running up an entrenched character that was known to Burlington for years and years and years, who's like a known quantity. So it's you definitely came very solid second, and so it's good that you guys have a proper structure. So, but what led you to the NDP? Because we have the Greens, we have the NDP, we have the Liberals. They're all quote unquote left of center. So what locked you onto the NDP as the ones?
The Liberals are left of center sometimes, and not always. And I mean, we can get into that if you want. But I mean, the reason I'm with the NDP is that my core value is that I believe it is everybody's responsibility to make sure that the people with the lowest incomes have the things they need to survive. Everybody deserves to have a place to live. Everybody deserves to have food to eat. Everybody deserves to have the medications they need, and everybody deserves to have clothes on their back. And we are failing at all four of those things for the lowest income Ontarians right now. So that's the core value that I believe in and that the NDP believes in, and that's why I'm running on this banner and part of this team.
That does dovetail into the party platform. So the first element on the party platform was making life more affordable.
Yeah.
And so the first one there was homes you can afford.
No, it is a very ambitious plan to do a considerable, and to be perfectly honest, there will be an additional plank of that platform being announced tomorrow. We're actually quite excited about it. This expansion of our housing platform is Andrea Horvath is coming to Burlington tomorrow morning to make that announcement. And I don't have the details of it yet, so I can't speak to the particulars of it. But the essence is that we believe that housing is a human right. Everybody deserves housing, and there are a number of different ways that needs to be addressed. I mean, you say the words affordable housing in this community, and it means very different people to very different things, to very different people. To the person who's living homeless in behind some trees on the street, it means they need to get into a shelter every night and have a roof over their head and be protected. To the people who are renting, they think it means, what are we going to do about rent controls? How are we going to, I'm stuck in this place that I am because I can't get to somebody else. To somebody in subsidized housing, it's, why can't I move from the 2-bedroom unit that I have right now, even though I have 5 kids, into a 3 or 4-bedroom unit because the waiting list for it is 10 years long and I'm stuck in these housing conditions. And to some people in Burlington, it means, how are my kids ever going to afford to buy their own house? And all of these are really valid concerns, and all of these are things that have gotten worse in the last 4 years.
The problem of the affordable housing in the Burlington context is that most of the people I know would never be able to afford to buy their house. The reason why they're in this house is because they had the house early, and then the house just keeps comically going up in value, right? But
yeah.
But you can't ever have imagined how you wouldn't have the amount of money, right? And when you're talking $1 million houses and you start going through the math, you need a couple professionals, making you need like $160,000 to get anything. That approaches sort of like what we're going to consider the traditional Burlington, and then even small apartments are now, the 400 square foot apartments going for like 340, 400-ish. It's a very small apartment. And even that, with interest rates going up, you're going to need more and more money. So you can kind of see it's a reaching escape velocity for the average person, right? So there's very ambitious stuff in this housing.
Absolutely. Ambitious and achievable, but ambitious.
Well, it's all achievable because you're the government. You can legislate whatever you want. Not whatever you want, but anything's achievable. It's just the downstream effects work like you think they're going.
Absolutely. And like, one of the things you learn at this moment you get into politics, and I'm sure you're acutely aware of it too, is nothing is simple. Everything has layer upon layer of complexity to it, that every decision you make impacts 10 different things, and everything needs to be very well thought out.
Yeah, there's like 4 simple things. One is seatbelts. The evidence of the efficacy of seatbelts is like overwhelming. There's like 0 counterpoints, and so there's no one against seatbelts. Nobody stands up and says I'm against seatbelts because the evidence is like a train wreck. The everything else has someone who puts their hands up and says I'm not entirely sure that's the world's greatest idea, and has some point. So it is complicated. But I'm going to for listeners, pick one out of here. So one thing it said in this platform was attempting to have pay with the last tenant paid. So endless rent control. So you couldn't have someone leave and then repost your apartment at market rates. And you can only go up by the increase every year, I suggest, which is like there's normally an allowable increase. It's like, that's 2 to 3%.
Like, and the details of this plan are still to be figured out. Like, there is still that we're going to impose some measure of control on switching tenants out, because the problem you have right now is, and like, this is, I can talk about the place I was last night. I was in some rental townhomes just south of Burlington Mall, and talking to the people there, and the ones who've been there for 10 years are paying whatever it is that they're paying in rent, and the ones who are moving in this month are paying nearly double that. Probably people there who've been there for 20 years who are paying a quarter of what a new tenant is paying, just because of these rent control laws. And the problem you get is, while this particular complex seemed to be very well run by good people who weren't trying to screw people over, et cetera, you certainly get in a position where you have companies who own a significant number of rental units, and they get incented to treat them badly. If you've been there for 10 years, the company wants to get you out, so that they want you to voluntarily leave so they can bring somebody else in and charge a much, much higher rate. So we need to disincentivize that activity. It doesn't need to be a dollar for dollar rate, because that doesn't make sense. And I get where you're going there, and I don't think that's the intention of the plan. But the intention is to introduce some measure of control to ensure that the rent in a unit doesn't jump from $800 to $2,800. Like, when you bring in a new person, And again, it is a very complex idea with a very complex set of circumstances behind it. But there needs to be a measure of control to disincentivize landlords from maintaining places in poor repair just to encourage people to leave so that they can fix it up and bring in new people at 4 times the rate.
I'm not an expert in law, but it has case happen like a so-called rent eviction actually happened to my mother. Right now, it turns out that they did renovate the property, and the owner did eventually move one of their family members into the unit. So the system kind of worked like it was supposed to in that case. That was a legal system, and they accommodated her in another unit. So it turned out not to be a big deal, right?
Right.
But you could, but the management company started off with this like hey, you got to move. We need your unit X thing, same thing. Uh, uh, Rents are much a great. It caused a lot of distress. I mean, yeah, the tension I think you have is um, the more it's the exploding rents that makes people excited about building these buildings, right? And so you can't have you can't have if we need more buildings. It's like my accountant calls this sucking and blowing. It's like you can't suck and blow at the same time. So if you're trying to make people's rents less affordable, you have to bet there'll be less rental buildings, right? Is that not? Am I missing something there?
Well, then it's got to be done and this is how everything intersects too. It's got to be in conjunction with building more units. It's got to be in conjunction with ensuring that the supply goes up at the same time to try and control the rental prices overall. Like, you're absolutely right that you eventually incent people, if you're not letting them charge market rates or not letting them approach market rates, I suppose is a better way to put it. We're trying to do that to disincentivize them from kicking their tenants out, but maybe you're incentivizing them to take the units off the market entirely. Like, it needs to be a very, very complex discussion where any regulations that we're bringing in are going to be done carefully, and they're going to be done in conjunction with all of the relevant stakeholders. And that's another big thing. I mean, I'm going to be jumping around here over the podcast, but it's a big thing that the NDP is committed to in virtually all of the things in that platform, is that as we move forward, the particulars of legislation will be done in collaboration with important stakeholders. It's the same reason that, like, and right now I'm just the candidate at a local level, and I appreciate that. But we've already opened a conversation with the chamber about minimum wage. Come to me with your ideas. We know we need to get minimum wage to where we want to get it to, and we believe that is important for workers in Ontario, and we think it is critically important. So we need to have a conversation with groups like the chamber, other groups representing small businesses, to ensure that we do this in the least painful way possible. We need to make sure that this works for everybody. We have goals we want to achieve, but the particulars of how we get to those goals need to be done in collaboration with stakeholders. And that's something that we're, to be blunt, going to do better than the past recent governments have done.
To summarize your point is that it says pay with the last tenant paid, but your point is around that is a nuanced approach to that. Not you rented this building out at $900 a month, and 40 years later you'll still be getting $900 for it.
Right. Yes.
It's just caps or some kind of reasonable percentage increase. Now, in all fairness, it is managed now, right? There's a maximum increase that you can take per renter. The current rental market is not,
but not if you're switching tenants. Like, you can go from $900 to $4,000 if you're switching tenants.
And it gives you a very bizarre incentive to destroy the whole building too.
Exactly.
If you destroy the whole building to a point where it's so condemned that the living units are inoperable now, what happens is everybody gets evicted under the basis of the fact that the building needs to be refurbed, and everyone needs to to move out while the building's being refurbed. At least my understanding. Obviously, there's a landlord-tenant board, and there's a case by case. And there's a big complication.
Again, lots of complexities and things that would come into play in that situation,
but it's not a free market now. Is the point? It's not. Yeah. It's not even anywhere close to a free market now. And your point is more intervention needs to. It's kind of like what's happening is
Well,
The
actually,
one intervention is setting up another problem in a way.
yeah, sure. I wanted to. There's big caveat to what you just said. There is that there is a free market for any unit built after 2018. Anything that came on the market 2018 or forward, there is no rent control. You can up it by 25% every month if you wanted to. Right, like within the
Right.
confines of leases and contracts and all of that. But there's no rent control gauging what it is you can do with that. I mean, ostensibly, that was, I imagine, done to encourage new rental growth. But what it's really allowed landlords to do is to like cordon off new basement apartments and charge whatever they want for it.
They got two loggerheads, right? Because I do see how, if you're one of these landlords and you're like, hey, I'm going to rent out my basement apartment, but my kid's just in, university for 4 years. Maybe he's coming back. He's going to get married. I might need this unit, right? And hey, there's this rent eviction, thing for family members. I'm sure in some people's head that is the difference. They say I can put this on and I can get this back, right? If you take this away, who knows what they're going to do? Now, listen, that seems like a corner case to me.
I agree.
But
Yeah.
I get your point, and I appreciate your indicating that there's a tension there. So I picked out two other points on homes you can afford because people are going to be very interested in this homes you can afford business, right?
Yeah, this is the issue that comes up the most at the doors. Absolutely. Within Burlington, this is what people care about.
Right, because it's gone beyond. Like the thing of it is you normally like when your house price increases, but it gets to a certain point where like, where are my kids going to live exactly? Like, how is this society functioning in any way when even if they went to university and even if they studied a 4 year degree and passed all that magically, they're opening up 60 grand a year jobs not going to cut it, right?
Let me give you a real example of that, just like with real numbers that I can speak to. We had, because I'm pretty sure you could find all this on the real estate board or whatever if you did a whole lot of digging, but I moved into this community in 2004, 18 years ago, and did that by purchasing a 3-bedroom townhome for $184,000. We sold that townhome just under 2 years ago for $562,000, and a similar townhome in that complex today goes for about $800,000. That is a fourfold increase in value in 18 years. It is absolutely crazy, and wages have not done anything remotely close to keeping up with that.
Same thing. I moved in Burlington. My house was around $350,000, and now it's $1 million for the ground. You could bulldoze my house, and the lot's worth $1 million.
Yeah,
Beyond sanity, and it is what it is. So your other 2 points are, well, actually, I shouldn't say it is what it is because you're going to do something about it.
that's it. Yeah.
Your other point is crack down on speculation.
Very, very much so. And this is, I was going to say the point I'm most excited about, but I hope the third one you've listed off is the one that I'm most excited about. But cracking down on speculation, it is a problem in Burlington. It is a much bigger problem in Toronto, but that by extension, what happens to Toronto housing prices also impacts everywhere else in Ontario. Like a great example of this. Jessica Bell, MPP for University Rosedale. She toured a building about a month ago now where it's a new condo development. All the units have been built. They're all habitable, and 60% of them are vacant because they were just purchased as real estate investments. And what this is doing is we're building all of this supply, but it's not actually being used for housing, so it's not doing anything to help housing prices. So what we're doing about that is a vacant home tax and not focusing on foreign buyers to give you more loopholes to set up a Canadian corporation and get around it that way and whatever else people do to try and get around these laws, but bringing in something where if a home is vacant for a year, you have to pay 2% of that home's value in additional tax. That's going to make a huge impact on forcing people to rent their investment properties.
This is the thing. It's never been clear to me why I mean, the bulk of people do rent them, but the people that don't rent them, that's what I've never been clear on. Most properties do better rented. Like somebody's there, like an abandoned single, family house is real trouble. I mean, people just knock on a window or something.
Oh, there's
Raccoon
one
gets in
down
the
by
attic.
Provincial Library. It's been not abandoned because they maintain the grounds, they mow the lawn, they keep it pretty, but it has been unoccupied for over a decade.
Was that because they're just waiting for land speculation? Is your
Yeah, like the value keeps going up. It's a hassle to be a landlord. You have to make sure that everything's in working order. You've got to deal with tenants who don't pay. You've got to deal with there's a considerable amount of repair that needs to go on to a home that's being occupied, and it is a considerable hassle. So for some people, it's been easier. It's just a real estate investment. They don't really care if it gets rented and going through that exercise, and they just let it sit vacant. And the point of the NDP is that it's not okay and it's not beneficial to Ontario. So we want to bring in policies to ensure that every available housing is used for housing.
Yeah, and although this case is a bit itchy because if you said, "Hey, you have to rent it out," it might knock the house down. I'd say problem solved. There's no house now, right? Now it's just vacant land.
I suppose. I think that's an edge case too.
Well, I think it is an edge case.
And to the point earlier, it's more directed at condo towers and apartments that are built but not used. Like no one's going to knock down a unit in a condo tower, and it prevents people from purchasing them without occupying them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. The question is, your point seems to be that no matter what you did with the rules, they wouldn't rent them out anyway, even if it was even if it was a fair market, even if all of the rules were set to be as nice as the landlord could have them. They could kick anybody out in 30 days and they can charge whatever they want. Your point is the burden of the tenant would still be enough in these cases that people would say it's just easier to leave my condo here as an investment property. Watch it go up 5%. Right. Okay, fair enough. Okay, what was your third?
So my third is the 10% down payment loan.
Okay, you tell me with that one because that wasn't my third, but go ahead.
So one of the other pieces of homes you can afford is something for people entering the home market. That it'll be means tested, and I couldn't rattle off the exact details top of my head for who this will apply to, but it will allow you to borrow up to 10% of the assessed value of the home towards a down payment on that home, and that to make sure that the government comes out okay, we'll charge you interest on that loan. But the key thing to it is that we won't ask you to make payments against that loan until you sell that property. If you buy your first home and you stay there for 20 years, you're not making payments against that loan for 20 years.
Yeah, it's government-backed loans.
It's a government-backed.
Complicated. Yeah. Hey, I'm involving the person so that the government owns 10% of the house, and then theoretically, if you sold that house in 10 years for $1 million, the government would get their 10% off the top, right?
Right, plus the interest accrued.
Oh, plus the interest accrued.
Because the biggest thing that keeps people out of the biggest problem with people getting into the housing market, particularly for starter homes, for new families trying to find a home, is that they don't have the capital for a down payment. They may be paying as much rent as they'd be paying against a mortgage, but they don't have the capital to put towards that home. So that's what that policy is designed to help with.
But the government theoretically is on the hook if they don't, if that becomes insolvent.
The house is going to accrue value over time as well. Like it's going to be a loan to the property.
I'll just say what the theoretical downsides are. I personally probably think that this plan at 10% is okay. But the person will say you're now pumping more. You're removing the risk from the bank, right? The bank has to do their due diligence currently because they have to make sure they get their money back, and then they do their down payment and they do their assessments. But their problem is they can still be on the hook, right? Now, if you build a system where they're not on the hook because the government's coming up with 10%, and that reduces the due diligence in the whole system, maybe you get more bankruptcies. Maybe you don't. The major cost to the bank is not the I think it costs something. I don't know. I've never understood this, but I think it costs them something like 50 to 70 grand to discharge, like a house.
Sure.
So that's their major concern. It's it's the administrative cost of discharging it, is the problem to them. The down payment, is in there somewhere, but it's mostly the administrative hassle and the crap. The minute it's theirs, it's what you said. The minute it's there, they're responsible for cutting the grass. They're responsible for no raccoons in the attic. They're responsible for all the stuff, and they have to pay. So I'm just going to say the opposite argument is going to be that means that more people will now be able to bid on this starter home, right? And that pushes prices up on the lower end
Sure. But it's why this has to be done in conjunction with more supply. What we're trying to do, and I mean, it goes along with getting rid of blind bidding, improving the processes of buying a home.
Okay, because it removes the requirement that you saved a down payment, and therefore levels the playing field on your.
Correct.
It removes the skin in the game theory, but the previous theory is why down payments is because it's skin in the game.
Well, I mean, like, we're only letting you borrow 10% of the assessed value. I mean, you're still putting in something of your own. It's just less that you have to put in.
Okay, so the one that jumped out on me, I'll try,
Sure.
is that ending exclusionary zoning.
Yes, that one is going to jump out at you. And anyone who's been involved in municipal politics ever.
It says increasing the supply of housing that are affordable in complete communities where people want to live while holding down the line on costly sprawl. So are you in? So I'll let you explain what the exclusionary zoning means.
So the essence is, like, and I think a great example of this is Hager Street. Hager Street is something that built up in an organic way in the way that we are trying to achieve by ending exclusionary zoning. You have many spots that are detached home, 3-story apartment building, detached home, 2-story apartment building, detached home. And the idea is that you can't do that in a street right now in Burlington. You can't do that, or in lots of other places too. You can't put in multifamily homes or multifamily buildings into residences, into neighborhoods that are designated for single family homes. And there are lots of reasons that that is bad policy, mainly that we need to grow. We need to keep growing. Our entire economy is based on the premise that Canada is going to get more people, and we're going to keep growing and building an economy around that. And we need to find a way to house those people without sprawling our boundaries into the greenbelt. That's the key principle here. One of the big ways to do that is to take a single dwelling family home that currently has 2, 3, 4 people in it and make it a 4-unit dwelling that can house 16 people.
I am extremely skeptical of the of a plan in which what you'd basically have is the reason why people like their house in the subdivision is it provides it has privacy to it. You have a yard. If you have kids, it's called a single family home. It's really a great product. You have kids, there's a backyard they can run around, and this kind of thing. The problem is if somebody's going to come right next to my house and build a 6-story apartment building and people can see down into my yard, right, removes the privacy. Maybe my house is in shadow, et cetera, et cetera. So the pure loss of exclusionary zoning in the way like the zealot means, I think is a terrible idea, because what happens is you revert to what was happening in the 1900s. And I don't know if you know this whole story, but in the 1900s, most people rented their houses, right? And uh, and what happened was the subdivision of what we're going to call exclusionary zoning, which is just basically zoning, right? You can only have a single family housing, so the theory goes, is what created this basis of I can have this house and I know my privacy is protected. I know no one's going to build something around me that's going to degrade the value of my property. And because of that, I feel comfortable moving here and establishing my life. It's basically the area is not going to change on you. So you can plan to live here for 20 or 30 years because you're not going to get that much change. I am skeptical that if you, I skeptical if you start coming on these streets and you start building 6, multifamily properties zone to zone, people aren't going to go some level of nuts.
Like everything, this needs to be subject to nuance and reasonable limits. The example I gave was putting 4 apartments in a spot, not a 6-story behemoth of an apartment building. Because you're right, if you put a 6-story apartment building and you're looking at somebody who's 100 feet on high, but right now we have a situation in a lot of neighborhoods in Burlington where people are tearing down the relatively small homes that they built and putting up 3-story behemoth homes that dwarf the existing neighborhood. But it's okay because they're only theoretically single family dwellings. I can put a single family 4,000 square foot home on a lot that, as long as I maintain it being a single family dwelling and I don't build the 4,000 square foot lot and carve it into 4 pieces. Like, that's the thing that we need to get the focus away from only one family can live there and into we need to start letting people use creative solutions to housing, finding ways to fit more people into the areas that we already have. And it's not like we've got to be really careful when we talk about those things that we don't make it all about extremes. Extremes is what's caused Burlington so much problem because maybe we can have a couple condo towers, and turns out now we have 3-story behemoths going up downtown, which isn't the reasoned and measured way that it was expected to be done. I mean, we can go on to the OLT and what's going on with the current government and why that's all not working for lots of municipalities, but Burlington in particular. But the essence is want to get to more reasoned development that can help solve our housing crisis. That makes sense. That's why I really worry about the branding it as 6-story.
I just think it's a bad strategy because what happens is what you get now in Burlington is if you look at the developments in Burlington, although the idea is there'll be mixed use around transit and build these compact, complete communities where you can get on a bus and you could, pick up your milk on the way home. Great. But if you actually look at the development and where they're going, it looks like somebody hit Burlington with a shotgun. It's just all over the place, right? It's not around transit routes. It's not building compact communities. Okay. What it is anyone who just so happens to have land and can pull this off and has enough money to drive it through the development process knows they'll win an OLT. And so there's no reason for them not to ask for the most lunatic height imaginable, especially because it stays there forever. So if I go and I get my permit for my building for my 50 stories, right? Right. I don't have to build that building. I have an armed permit that I can build that 50-story building, right? I can sell that to someone else. I can sit on it for 25 years and then pop up like a little groundhog and go, here comes my 50-story building, right? So there's no reason at all for the developers not to go through this process to get these permits, to get them as high as possible, because they can always go lower. They don't have to build a 50-story building, right? If they're building a 50-story building in 10 years, they say, oh, you know what? The mechanics of it are only 40 stories. So I have a bad experience with the current scheme of development, in that even without saying, hey, you can go into the middle or the section or have some rules about invading a subdivision, no, say invading, but building more central to the subdivision, right? Even the edge stuff to me is not redeveloping all of the things that people are selling on, and yet all of our commerce, if you really study, is collapsing up to Clapson's Corners and is collapsing up to this massive I don't even know what you want to call it, commercial park at Appleby and Highway 5, right? Like, as you redevelop these things lower down, people didn't decide, I don't want to go to a big box store. They did. They just rebuilt them, where they were allowed to.
Yeah.
What I see is the development being driven into these massive power plants, where I'm like, no, I liked what I had in my local, my local grocery store and my local whatever. Now, you don't, I'm not suggesting you have to freeze things in time and not have these things move. But
Sure.
I found what you're saying creates this model that more people is better.
More people is necessary. Burlington needs to grow. And I think that is an absolute fact that we've got to start from.
The trouble is that if you take Burlington and say Burlington has to grow, right, and it grows, but it doesn't grow, and you get an offset of transit working, right? You can say, hey, Burlington needs to grow, but we're going to put up a whole bunch of apartment buildings with a whole bunch of cars under them, right? And everyone's going to go spilling out of their cars at 9 a.m. And I don't think that growth will be accommodated in a way that you like. See what I'm saying?
No, I see what you're saying there, and that's why we do need, like, I love the Oval Court development. I mean, we can talk about particulars and what green space they're going to build and all of that, but the idea that we're building intensive towers beside Appleby Go is the sort of development our city needs. What I'm saying is that on top of that, to ensure, because we're really rapidly running out of places to build intensive residential developments, there aren't that many, there are only 3 GO stations. We need to also look at what we can do to end exclusionary zoning and get more housing units out of the available space that we have in neighborhoods. Like, I don't think, you were talking earlier about like people and character of neighborhoods, and I lived in this place and I don't want people looking down on me, and I don't accept the premise that, using Hager Street again as my example, that Hager Street is necessarily a worse neighborhood than a street that only has single family homes. I think that model really can be done if you build small, and by small I'm talking 2 to 3 story multi-unit dwellings within a single lot. And that will go a long way to encouraging us to spread out our growth and to do it in a manageable way.
Right. But back to my point, if the growth is spread out but not clustered around transit, it's a disaster. We all agree, right? So you could if you double or triple the cars, it's traffic everywhere, and
it needs to be done in conjunction with better transit and better, like, not just transit, but more encouragement and planning from the city in terms of walking and biking as well. Like, and encouraging amenities within neighborhoods that you can exist in without a car. I mean, you can exist. I like the townhomes that I bought and moved out of 2 years ago. It was right north of Appleby Mall. That is a wonderful spot that has most of your basic amenities. You can live near there and walk to the grocery store. You can walk to the transit that goes up and down Appleby and catch transit to Appleby Go if you need to get to Toronto. Like, it is possible to do in that particular location.
Yeah, I've never had any kind of objections to building higher forms of density around clustered transit that I can see. Right? If you, I mothballed this thing. I said, well, why don't we go from Oakville to Milton with the subway? There's farmers' fields. Just build it now. Dig a trench, build your subway, connect the GO line at Oakville to the GO line at Milton, and you just build the subway right up in the middle of nowhere, right? And because that's cheap to do, you can cluster around, you get the whole system work. Where I'm skeptical of is you go into this thing, you refit, right? When it's the refit into the existing community, I don't see why all you end up with is a hodgepodge of people who are all still using cars. Like, we still have 1 unit per car at all of these buildings. There is a crap load more of cars coming under what's going on currently, right? Each one of these condos has more cars, more cars, more cars, more cars. And when I say, well, where all the cars are going to go, people say, well, we're going to get transit going. And I say, nah, okay, maybe one more COVID and that will go game over, right? Or COVID-like thing, it still hasn't rebounded now, right? And I go, okay, I see what you're doing in terms of your dream. But for me, I want the dream backwards. I want you to build the transit along a line. It all exists. We can build a whole community high density where people know they're moving into the high density, right? And have structured their lives accordingly to live in that high density. Whereas I don't see any transit solution in the world that helps you if you simply take every house in, every, this is my point. If you go in deep in these subdivisions and you start just taking singles and turning them into duplexes, let's say, which is the form of gentle end of exclusionary zoning that people don't mind, right?
Yeah.
The least upsetting form is when they turn one house into a duplex. If your change now just turned one driveway into two and two cars into four, right? It's all spread out. It's everywhere, right? That's the part where I'm like, with that, where I'm skeptical that helps you. I'm not skeptical that if you want to build a bunch of big high buildings right beside the GO train, okay, I can see my way to it. Whether the GO train is effective enough mass transit in its current form, I'm skeptical. But at least it's possible in my mind, right? Whereas the end of the zoning, to me, takes your spread out car based low density subdivision and turns it into a medium spread out car based subdivision, right? We're cutting out along trees, turning single houses into duplexes. Like every time you cut back the green space, the yards go. You know what I mean? It's my observation from satellite that there is more trees and there's way more trees and way more green space in Aldershot than the Orchard, right? There's just way more big trees and
I'll buy that. I don't know that I buy that lawns are necessarily useful green space, people's front lawns and stuff, but I certainly, there are more trees in Aldershot than the Orchard, I will accept.
yeah, listen, I'm not like in love with front lawns. I'm in love with back lawns because the kids run around on them, and that's just convenient. Okay, we'll move on to our disagreement about development.
Yeah, we spent almost an hour on housing.
We'll table it. Well, we'll go through. You guys have a lot of things you plan, but in all fairness, that is the thing that people in Burlington are going to gravitate to. The housing prices and development is.
As I said, it's the number one thing at the doors. It is the thing I'm talking about every night.
I know it's dear to their heart too, which is why I had it first on the list, and presumably why you're doing the thing too. So we have fixing our healthcare system.
Of course.
University public funded mental health care.
Yes.
Supportive housing, 30,000 new supportive housing units, and then there's two. So here's the two you can comment on. They're big ticket items. So the first one is dental care for every Ontarian. Should every Ontarian have dental care?
Yes. Unequivocally, yes. Dental care should be health care.
Yeah, it's just a bit weird that it isn't. Eye care never made sense to me either.
Yeah, like eye care was for right. It's and like the amount of, and I can't again. I don't have figures that I can quote off the top of my head, but the amount of money that we spend treating people in emergency rooms for things that they should have had preventative care for but couldn't afford it is astronomical. The number of times that somebody has to go to Emerge because they need a root canal is crazy. And every time like somebody walks in the door of Emerge, it's already cost us hundreds of dollars before we do anything. And I just like by nature of the healthcare system, it is very expensive to treat people and more expensive to treat people in a hospital. So the general principle here is the more preventative care that we can do, the better off we're all going to be.
Yeah, and for people listening, the general idea of why that's so is because the hospital has to be ready for everything, right? So what happens is you end up using an emergency doctor and an esthetician and a bed that could have things and nursing staff that's ready for everything instead of a dental office that's just ready for your root canal and dental procedures.
Well, and because lots of these things can be handled with relatively cheap preventative care, and when they get to acute stages, are much more expensive interventions.
Yeah, your dentist is likely not a dental surgeon. Your dentist takes care of your teeth. The dental surgeon puts your face back together when it's been hit with a baseball bat, right? So that guy is the hospital-based dental care that exists. And a big ticket item, many more years of training, extra equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the theory behind that. Yeah, I'll buy that. I'll buy that. I don't quite understand why eye care, it's cost, I mean, but I don't quite understand why eye care and dental care managed to magically pop itself out of required services when, I mean, we're not going to buy people $1,000 glasses, but we can certainly, get you 250 an eye exam and a $250 frame under some framework. That doesn't seem to be really an unreasonable thing for me to do. And then here's a big explosive item. This is like explosive. Is the Bill 124, which caps public sector. The Bill 124 caps public sector wages at 1%, right?
Yeah.
So inflation's 5.
Yeah, I've got. I mean, and this is the other conversation that I have at the doors all the time. These are the two big things that we talk about: is particularly nurses and housing. So you've got a healthcare system that has been considerably stressed for the last 2 years, more so than it was before. Not that the healthcare system was in great shape going into 2020. We had problems. A primary focus of the 2018 election had been, how are we going to improve healthcare? The party that won that election came in and didn't make many improvements, so we were still in the state that we were. Now we've added COVID and everything that's happened over the last couple of years onto that burden, particularly for nurses. And now reams of them have left the field because it's too stressful. They're not treated well enough. And on top of that, you're telling them that they're these heroes, and you're then asking them to accept only a 1% wage increase every year when inflation is 5 or 6. So pretty much they're losing money against their paychecks every year. Who would want to actively go into that? And the ones that are there, lots of them are leaving. So we absolutely, if we are going to solve healthcare in Ontario, we can only do it if we pay nurses better and we treat nurses better. Those are requirements before you can try and, anybody who seriously wants to fix healthcare in Ontario needs to fix those things before they can get started at solving the structural problems in healthcare.
To animate your next conversation at the door, let's say you're a nurse, let's say you're a senior nurse or whatever, make 85 grand a year, right? So if inflation is rolling at 5%, you're out $4,000 a year, right? Just
Yep, sure.
So that means you're losing $300 a month. Like, that means yesterday you could buy that coffee on the way to work, right? Because you're losing $10 a day. That's how brutally your standard of living is getting sliced off $10 a day. And most people, I find, myself included, I don't have 200, 300, 400 extra bucks a month.
That's like, and to be blunt, this isn't just a nursing problem. This is, everything is getting more expensive. Gas is getting more expensive. Food is getting more expensive. Your coffee is getting more expensive. Cost of living is going way up, and wages aren't keeping up with that increase.
Well, what happens is some people's wages do. So I always ask the question, who benefits from these places that get high inflation, right? There's the same amount of money that's sloshing around. Who's actually the beneficiary when, who ends up profiting the most when you get to a place that has high inflation? And the answer seems to be anybody that can rapidly reprice their services. So anybody who can just rapidly say, here's the new price, contractors, like anybody like that.
Is that just a fancy way of saying gas stations and oil and gas companies?
No, but anybody who's in this mode, but that's why, who else can rapidly reprice their produce? A grocery store can, right?
Yeah.
That the whole chain to blueberries or chain to strawberries or chain to whatever we're interested in. All of those people can rapidly reprice, and the strawberries go from $9 to 10 to, talking about a Costco size thing of strawberries, 9, 10, 11 up, which you've seen. It just goes 9, 10, 11. Roast used to be cheap meal because I have 4 kids. So we make a roast, feed it all, 4 kids eat a surprising amount of food. Roast used to be a cheap thing. I was like, this is a real cost-effective meal. You know what I mean? Roast, gravy, some vegetable, potatoes, everyone's happy. And you see all those input costs set up. Yeah, and this is going to be a huge deal. And if you're so elected, the bomb that's coming is nurses and teachers.
Yeah.
Because they're very unlikely they're going to be in demand, for one, and they're very, very unlikely to accept a continued reduction in their wages, if you ask me. And they have unions, and they can do stuff about it. So it'll be an exciting 4 years.
being able to bargain for reasonable wages should be a core tenet for every person in Ontario. That is like, you shouldn't be constrained by provincial legislation that prevents you from effectively negotiating what your salary is going to be.
What they're trying to do with the 1% in their mind is basically affect a public service wage decrease, right? They're cutting the salaries of public sector workers. But instead of the insanely unpalatable way of saying we'll do it 10%, we'll say we'll give you
Some public sector workers, the ones that have unions they don't like.
Yeah, but in all fairness, it is the biggest two unions too.
Sure, also the biggest two.
They can just be scared of the blowback. But you're right that there's potentially a political dimension.
Bill 124 doesn't affect police officers, doesn't affect doctors, doesn't affect a number of other politicians. Lots of other government agencies weren't affected. The primary focus of that bill was teachers and nurses. Just want to emphasize.
There's a lot of teachers and a lot of nurses, though.
There certainly are.
There's way more teachers and nurses than are police officers. So I'll give them the benefit of the doubt where they went, okay, this is the biggest two public sector units. What are we going to do if they demand a 5% raise? It's going to really, it's going to create a tax increase that we're going to get hit for. There's no way about it around it, right? And go from there. So continuing on with your ambitious agenda, fixing long-term care, fixing the system by making it public.
Ambitious and achievable. You're missing the key words there.
Well, it's all achievable.
I'm contesting the boxing of it as ambitious agenda implies that there is some measure of it not being achievable.
It's uncosted, so I can't attack it on that.
Fair enough. It will be costed at some point in the campaign. We just weren't able to get the numbers to cost it out until last week.
Yeah, but see, this is the thing. The reason why I'm going to call it ambitious, or the problem is I can't comment on the achievability of it because you have to present cost information for me to say this is reasonable, right? And it'll turn into a quagmire. So if I sit there and say immediately building, not even, we're immediately building 50,000 new and modern beds, right? Well, there's no way to immediately build 50,000 beds to start with. There's a whole planning process, and you're going to have new facilities. It takes a while, but I get the point that immediately. But if we start arguing over what those 50,000 beds will cost, I'm not able to come up with a reasonable number, right? So if you had numbers, I could then see if it was reasonable.
Right. I'm not expecting you to necessarily brand it as being achievable because, to be fair, you don't have that costing and you can't have that. I'm simply taking issue with only branding it as ambitious.
Yeah, I will. Okay, I will, for the record, give you that it's all achievable because you can simply, without cost information, you can order these things, right? You can because you have legislative changes, right? So if you ignore the results of the legislative change, I can say, oh, I'm going to hire 50. You know what I mean? I can hire 50,000 new nurses. The cost, you could make, if you say my legislative agenda is making minimum wage $400, you can do that legislatively, and then it's an exciting 6 months and we see how it comes out. So I'll give you that it's all achievable.
Yeah. Let's move on from branding and make sure that we focus our time on it.
Pay the bills. Raise the minimum wage to $20 by 2026.
Needs to be done. It's like, so I don't know how much you've engaged with Living Wage Halton.
You go to a round table where they invite, these the people that invite you to a round table, and then they bring in people and they tell you their experience?
I think that's Poverty Free Halton.
Okay, sorry, I apologize.
But the round table. But anyway, Living Wage Halton is a group that goes through and does a very detailed analysis on what a basic family needs to have a good life. They take a prototypical family with 2 parents, 2 kids, put them in a 3-bedroom apartment, give them one car, have the other parent take transit, walk through all of these things. They go to the movies 4 times a year. They go out to eat 6 times a year. They take a 1 week camping trip in the summer, and they lay out all of those costs. What it would the average cost of an apartment, the average cost of hydro, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and come down with how much money does a family need to live that existence in this region. And for Halton right now, or as of 2020 or 2021, or the most recent numbers we have, you need 2 parents who make $20.75 an hour to support a basic, not extravagant existence. So that's when I look at your living wage to live a reasonable, decent life in this community is a full-time job paying $20.75, and we're still taking 4 more years to get minimum wage up to $20. It's almost the least we can do.
So the counter argument, though, is the latter argument. So the counter argument is, if you had no minimum wage, then what I would do at my whatever job it is I would have a position where I would be willing to hire some kid for $5 an hour to just clean the shop up or do something like that, right? And you would create all these lower positions initially. Maybe it's $5 for the first 2 weeks, and this guy's doing. I get $10, and it would put more people on a ladder, because everybody could get on the ladder at some dollars per hour, right? But when you increase the minimum wage up and up and up, what happens is people go, well, to hire this person, I got to get my $160 out a day now, and I won't hire that kid to sweep up. I won't hire a kid to just photocopy stuff at my law clerk for that, right? That's the counter argument.
But you're like, put that in the context of Burlington. Like, again, I live over in Pinedale, so the McDonald's near me has had big signs up on their windows for months of essentially, please come work for us, starting wage $16 an hour, more if you have experience. Like, even with minimum wage where it is, in this city, people are desperate for workers. But I want to return back to that idea of your ladder increase too, because the bigger problem there is that without a minimum wage, employers will take advantage, particularly of newcomers to Canada, people who don't have access to the systems to fight for their basic employment rights. You end up with temp workers in terrible working situations. Without the protection of a minimum wage, you'd have immigrants working for your $5 an hour job that you supposed to a kid, because we think of it in a downtown Burlington type context. But within Ontario, you'll end up having that wage to apply to many, many adults who will then be jamming themselves into basement apartments, all pitching in to just try to afford some place to stay and basic food to eat. That's why we need minimum wage protections.
I won't take credit for that idea. That's Tom Sowell's idea. I just repeat it. When I that's his latter idea is I won't say it's his idea, but that the school of thought is, why don't we just make the minimum wage $50 an hour if it's also great? Well, the reason why we don't do that is because we're going to create an inflationary spike that'll probably burn people at the lowest end of the spectrum the most, right? And two, we create such a ladder now, right, that there's still be lots of people employed if you made the minimum wage $50 an hour, right? But lots of people wouldn't be able to get on the ladder. It's not my idea. I want to take credit for it.
I understand, but the point of minimum wage is we want to get to, right, and the way we brand that idea is a livable minimum wage, which ties into the living wage Halton idea of right now it's $20.75. So that should be the goal. Doesn't need to be higher than that, but that's what you need to live a reasonable existence in this city. So we need to have minimum wages that get towards a living wage. We don't need it to be higher. Like, the hypothetical $50 doesn't make any sense, because that's more than what we need the minimum wage to be.
No, I do appreciate the grounding off a calculation of what represents a reasonable a reasonable thing. And I always say this is kind of like wage plus, but I always say if you take people and you send them to advanced education and they produce debt and they go through all the trouble of working for 4 years and paying these things off and they're settled down with kids. Now listen, they might not be able to fly to Disney World. Nobody's saying they can't get to Disney World, every year, right? But if you get them to a place where they can never take their kids to Disney World, you know what I mean? That all of these opportunities are just off the table, then they're going to become, let's say, politically invested in saying, this system doesn't work for me. I went to university for 4 years. I paid all that money off. You know what I mean? I X, Y. And so that's my point is that all income stratas, I think mine is the super high end. You can't get people to engage on on the same issue. So I appreciate the minimum wage comes from that calculation, and that makes sense. But that would be in this region. How would you work that with other regions that would be less? Am I crazy?
Minimum wage doesn't work if it's not a provincial standard. And that's one of the really big distinguishing points between our plan and the Liberal plan is they've got a convoluted, we're going to put the regional minimum wage thing. But then you've got the same problem you have in lots of areas of the United States where, okay, you work at RBG, you make this amount of money, but you work at the coffee shop down the street from RBG because it's in Hamilton, not in Halton, you make this amount. And there's lots of things that don't make sense about applying that regional approach. It's not clean. So it's much better and more manageable and more enforceable to have a provincial standard to it. Because you're right. Living wage in Halton is $20.75. In other places, it's lower than 20. In Toronto, it's 23, 24, somewhere in there. It is a very different standard across the province. I mean, to be blunt, by the time we get to 2026, especially with the rising costs of food and gas, it's going to be over 20 everywhere. $20 is actually going to be quite insufficient by 2026. But there's also a limit to how fast you can do this. To my earlier point of collaborating with businesses, you can't do this at such an accelerated pace that it's going to crush small business.
Well, yes, and you can't. The macroeconomic problem is you can't control the Feds, right? But when the Feds are jacking up interest rates, right, and they're not gonna roll bonds, right? They're attempting to crush everyone. Like the purpose of high interest rates and the reason why it stifles inflation is because everyone's crushed, right? It's to take all of your to change the macro optics of the situation so much that money becomes so dear, right? That less people buy strawberries and there's less pressure on strawberries, and then the strawberry farmer can't. Now he's got strawberries. He can't sell them for 10. He's got to sell them for 9 now because he's just piled up strawberries. And you get this once people lose.
I like that your hypothetical is strawberries. That amuses me greatly.
I think strawberries is good because you're a strawberry farmer, you're producing strawberries, right? Now you got to sell these strawberries. And strawberry pricing has just gone crazy up, up, and up. But if you make strawberries expensive, nobody really needs strawberries. They could just say, hey, I'm not going to eat strawberries, right?
Yep.
So it should hit some number where people go, screw it, I'm not buying strawberries for $5, a little quart of it, right? Or whatever it is.
Whatever.
And then it cuts down. My point is on the macro level, when the Feds reverse quantitative easing and jack up the interest rates, what they're doing is they're pulling money out of the economy. If you could see how many total Canadian dollars existed on a spreadsheet, right? Every day it goes down. There's just less Canadian dollars in the world, less Canadian dollars in the world. It's getting dearer and dearer and dearer. And they intend to make it so dear that you are just happy getting by and paying your mortgage, and you know what I mean? So that prices so that they can crush demand and then the prices stabilize. At least that's the the theory of why high interest rates decrease inflation, right? Because and so the point is, under your plan, while you're juicing and trying to build up these expectation of higher wages, right? The Feds are trying to crush expectations of higher wages. Like their horror is when people write these do these long-term agreements with unions, and it says we're going to get 5% every year for the next 4 years, and you're now creating union contracts with this like wage growth in. That to them is like alarm mode, because their inflation rate is 2%. They can't have if it starts being 5%, they're just gonna keep jacking the interest rate and pulling money out until it's so dear, right?
It's pretty aggressive hypothetical to say that somebody's going to agree to a 4-year deal with 5% per year, but I do understand the point you're making.
That's what just blew up the Contractors Association deal. Is that they wanted inflation in the because like right now there's a strike of like trades, right? And in that thing that I read, the disagreement was on this inflation bump that they said we're going to go on strike. And I forget. It's like the contractors thing is very complicated. There's like roofers and framing people, and they're all in different little groups, but they bind together for this collective arbitration. And that was what the complaint is. Hey, we want our X% a year, right? My point is, if you get agreement after agreement after agreement that starts baking in like 5% or inflation plus 1 or whatever it is, then the feds are going to get antsy. At least the central bank is, not the feds. They're going to do what they want to do. So it's a complicated scenario where you are attempting to improve wages when the feds are trying to decrease expectation in higher wages. You see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying. I mean, it's not going to change our goal to increase wages for people in Ontario. That's
no, I'm not suggesting like
a key goal of ours.
I don't see why there's any reason that we should have this this current weird thing where somebody works at a desk is oh so more valuable than somebody who's pulling skids of tomatoes off a truck all day. I don't understand why we've hit upon this idea that there's this magical protected class of white collar workers that are doing oh so much, and other people aren't doing a lot too. So I don't have it in my head there's some magical reason that people who work at a coffee shop shouldn't be able to command whatever they can command in terms of wages or jobs that don't require a huge amount of training to just get involved with, right? Okay, we got to run through the rest of your things. I'm going to hit the bigs. So fixing educations in schools is it hired 20,000 teachers and education workers.
We're that amount short. It's the principle here is things have been broken for so long, we have to fix them. And fixing them requires that investment in people.
All right, fair enough. Here's another big one. Here's a big one. It says regulate gas prices. It says stop gouging at the pump. Will direct Ontario Energy Board to regulate the retail price and wholesale markup of gas to stop big oil companies from gouging Ontarians. That's a major change.
It is a huge change. And the particular of how that's going to come out, I don't know if it was captured in that language. The biggest thing that would do would be a regulation of when prices could change. So it's not a daily thing. It's not a nightly thing. It's a once a week, we'll change the price of gas, and then you can count on that price for the rest of the week. Because right now, there is nobody who thinks that the unregulated price of gas is working for anybody but gas companies. I don't think there's anyone who thinks the price of gas is fair or is being determined in a reasonable way and isn't some collusion of the collective companies. Like there's never sales on gas. There's never competition between gas companies on pricing. It's just sold as a commodity at the whim of the gas producers, which is the other thing. And I as I'm sure you're aware, I try very hard not to get negative, and I never get personal about people. But the idea that taking 10 or 11 cents off the gas tax for a temporary amount of time is going to have any appreciable impact on the price of gas, like this, again, to your point on many of the points you've made, basic economics. If people are willing to pay $1.95 for a liter of gas, then gas companies are going to charge $1.95 for gas. it doesn't matter how much tax is being pushed into that number. If they can sell it for $1.95, they will. It's like the strawberry farmer. If he can sell it for 11, he'll sell for 11. If he can only sell for 9, he'll sell for 9. The same goes with gas companies. The gas tax is not what is driving up the price of gas. It's people's willingness to buy gas.
Well, it's until it stops use, right? So it's like they're willing the gas price to go. They want the gas price to be as high as it can be, right? Unless it
Yeah,
prevents somebody from doing something. So if you actually go, oh, gas is so expensive, I'm not driving to Florida. Well, now they don't like that idea because they
sure.
still want as much gas used as possible.
My point is that gas pricing is a market decision more than it is a taxation decision.
Yeah. Oh no. Listen, the 10% out is meaningless to you on the consumer level because it's so high already. It's going up so much. Removes a massive amount of money for the upkeep of roads, but it's just a way for the politician to say, I'm going to get out of the way of this freight train because I'm going to say, I did what I could. I gave you guys 10%.
And it's going to make zero tangible difference to anybody. It's just taking government money and throwing it away. Very similar to a license plate sticker refunds.
I will say what happens though is that you do have an international price of oil, right? And the system that we have with the market, what it does do is ensures there's always gas in the pump.
Yep.
Whenever there's less gas or less oil, we never lose. But lots of countries lose. They're the people that can't afford, you know what I mean? When there's a shortage of gasoline and a shortage of oil, and everybody can't be accommodated for, right? And the prices go up. We just suck the price up and keep on trucking because everybody's got to get to work, right? But but on the lower economic strata, that's where people get screwed, and can't get to work and
Because there are people who can't actually afford to pay $100 to fill up their car with gas.
oh, it's brutal. I agree that the input of this gas price, it's like cancer because it takes all this money out in which somebody would be doing something protective on the economy, even if they take their kids out for dinner, right? They
Yep.
relax, it's a nice time, the kids have a nice time, and we've done something productive. Well, that's a lot more interesting than filling up the bottom line of some company in Saudi Arabia to me, which is
Yes.
basically what's happening.
We're not talking about any sort of intense control over gas prices. It's just starting to regulate when they can change and starting to oversee what the real markups actually are. That's all we're looking to do.
Yeah, I don't know how in practice though there is some competition because the prices do tumble down, right?
Sure, at every station at the exact same time.
Yeah, well, they're all buying from the same wholesale market, aren't they? Like, am I wrong? Or
They do their own amount of refining.
my long-term understanding of the problem is that nobody wants a gas refinery anywhere near them. If you want to talk about the sixth floor building, try to start building a gas refinery, right? And heave through that. And then so these buildings, when they're with these structures, when you see these nice, I just listened to a whole guy explain this whole thing to me, and it was all based on something I didn't understand previously, which was how come the U.S. is energy surplus yet importing Russian oil? Why? It doesn't make any sense. I never understood this, and it turns out that this guy explained it. It's because the type of oil is all different, and there's like heavy sour, and we make heavy sour, and the Russians make heavy sour. And what happened is in the States, they thought they'd be out of light sweet crude, which is what they make, or just produce out of the oil. So the refiners bet on the Keystone Pipeline, bet on oil from Canada, and bet on regulatory pipelines that would allow them to make gasoline in the Gulf of Mexico. And when that fell apart, they ship so much on trains, but there's a limit to that. And so that's why this weird refining system exists in which all the oil is shipped to the Gulf of Mexico, then turned into gasoline and shipped back, which seems bizarrely nuts. But it's not all of it. There's obviously some refining capacity, but that's what creates this change around. So I'm not the I think the one price change per week is interesting. I'll have to table that to say, is that better for people to have the stability throughout the week, versus this weird thing now where you go every day and it's different. So that's an interesting policy. Definitely, the progressive conservative party will not be implementing that.
True story.
And we're getting here to the exciting stuff. Not the pre stuff. Wasn't excited. Ban predatory payday loans.
That's and like, I can speak very passionately about this subject. I will be honest, I have not dug into the details of this particular policy, but the idea of the number of people who get sucked into a payday loan cycle because the aggressive tactics to market a payday loan, and then if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you end up paying 20% interest off of those paychecks to a payday loan supplier, it just, people get trapped in a terrible cycle that is entirely the design of the payday loan company. They want you to take an advance on a paycheck and then have to pay them extra, and then you be forced to take an advance on the next one to pay off your old loan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you get trapped in this cycle, and there's no good reason for it to exist.
Well, listen, I agree with you. I think it seems crazy. You know what I mean? This weird unbanked thing too, where people can't, because of some scuffle or whatever, don't have bank accounts. So this is the way they're cashing checks, and they're charging like $5. That seems insanely, predatory as well. I did hear one guy who spoke. I don't know if I agreed with him, but I did hear one guy who spoke very passionately about the idea that, listen, you don't need the advance, right? But if you were this poor and you need this advance, there's a reason for it. There's a logic behind it. It's because you either get an advance on this paycheck and you pay your rent, and you want this facility, and if it goes away, you're screwed. But it does seem to me there would have to be,
well, and it's a matter of, one, ensuring it's not predatory. Like, the idea of having a payday loan is very different from having an entire industry that is designed around encouraging people to take payday loans. Having the service and having it being something that is sold and marketed are very, very different things. Because sure, there are lots of times that somebody may in their lives need a payday loan to pay for whatever it is. But the system we have right now, with the absolutely ridiculous interest rates that these places charge and the amount of money that they then spend on marketing to encourage people to take those rates so that they can accrue that interest, there's no benefit to society happening from that kind of activity. I understand the idea that payday loans maybe need to exist and there will be a time and a place for it, but that's not what we have right now.
Yeah, and the number of them is freaky too. There's a freaky number of them in $5,000 a month pad sites. You're like,
the only thing that there are more of in places like Burlington than payday loan shops is pot shops.
The proliferation of pot shops in Burlington is wild. If you told me how many pot shops can Burlington actually sustain, I would have capped it at 12.
I'm not objecting to it necessarily. I'm just stunned that many of them can exist.
Well, Oakville, I think, still bans them, right?
Yeah.
So we're getting Oakville bleed over, in all fairness.
Yeah.
That was the thing. Okay, we got two more, and then I got a couple viewer questions. And then you're off the hook. So the next thing, you had two more parts of your policy: honoring the inherent rights, treaties, and ways of life for Indigenous people.
It is recognition that this needs to be a part of everything that we do. That governments for hundreds of years have been terrible at doing this, that we do not collaborate, we do not recognize, these inherent treaty rights need to be respected, and that needs to be one of the lenses from which we approach every government policy. And that doesn't even get into things like Grassy Narrows, where the government allowed companies to set up and pollute the water, and it's 40 years later and the water's still polluted. These are things that, quite frankly, just need to be addressed and need to be considered in every piece of government policy.
I don't have any complaints over the Indigenous policy per se. The only sticky wicket I always stick is the idea of reconciliation, because I had a couple talks with Indigenous people, and reconciliation implies a preposition of togetherness, and then there's like a breakup. If only we could reconcile back to this time, when everyone was happy, right? And I don't think reconciliation is uh, um, the right word, because there's no thing to reconcile back to, right? The thing that you're trying to get is of acknowledgement of different ways and different sort of spiritual views, which is very difficult out of the Roman Greek intellectual.
So I think I'm going to contest that, and difficult for me because I am not an expert in this area, and I'm cognizant that I am not an expert in this area. But the idea of reconciliation is reconciling back to the intentions of the treaties that were signed and the expectations at that time of reconciling what has happened today with what was expected to happen based off of those treaties. And I think it's very important to look at what the expectations had been for the relationship that we were going to have with Indigenous peoples and what that relationship actually ended up being, which was in a lot of ways terrible. And some of the, especially some of the things with residential schools and the various ways that Indigenous culture has been suppressed throughout Ontario's history, that there is a lot of, and I really do think reconciling and reconciliation are the right words here, with what should have happened versus what did happen.
Again, I'm no expert, so we could use an expert.
Yeah, neither of us are the right people really to be talking about.
Right, exactly. But the reason why I say that is because I did do a whole podcast with a couple podcasts on the subject, and the thing that jumps out on me is the treaty system that they're talking about is not a treaty system. At least some of them, the Indigenous are not a unitary group. There's obviously different people that do different things. But when they say the treaty system, they're not talking about a system of treaties that is between um, one group of Indigenous and the settlers. This is the system of peaceful coexistence everywhere. So they have treaties with the band one over. They have this treaty. They have this treaty. They have this treaty. Right, and those it's a web of non-written down structural understandings created by chiefs through long form dialogue, right? That's not really written down. We got excited about writing things down, right? But they don't have they are in a web of these agreements with neighboring people out. And when some of them say treaty, it occurs to me that their idea is that you're like the group next over, and you're one of the web of treaty agreements. See, like, we're the people that are saying, okay, there's a treaty, we have to write this down, right? Originally, I think there was some in Latin. They need translators. It's like, we're writing this down. We're creating this legal structure that exists in our way of thinking, right? They're creating relationships between groups and an understanding between the group. You see what I'm saying? So I don't think the systems actually reconcile at the end of the day. That's my fear.
Fair, but nothing in the intentions of any of these treaties, be they written down, be they passed from chief to chief, however you choose to define it, none of the intentions were systems where we went to Indigenous families and stole their children and put them into religious schools.
Yeah, but it's more. I mean, that's
Reconciling what we said we were going to do and how we were going to work with Indigenous peoples against what we did do is an important part of moving. We can't move forward unless we recognize what we did in the past.
yeah, listen. There's a old. I mean, again, I get no history, but not expert in history. But I believe there's a time when there's more peaceful coexistence, and then the relationship sort of breaks down as settlers are taking more and more land, which is a fixed farming method, and the Indigenous of the time have a mobile farming method, but they can't stay in one place because their farming method makes them grow. There's an identification that among the indigenous themselves that this mobility is dying, and it creates this set of optional industrial schools, which then breaks, and then this system breaks down, and there's lots of schemes at that time that different people have to try and figure out how to coexist the two systems. Can indigenous people learn European style farming? Because the problem is there's this diametric difference between European style farming, where you can stay in a place, and what they've traditionally practiced. And all these systems are just starting to hit, right? And there's an identification that even among indigenous themselves, that this is sort of going, just roving around randomly, not randomly, but roving from place to place in the land. And then there's a series of it's all, if you get into the history, it's all the backdrops of the different churches too, crapping around between the Anglican Church and the Methodists. There's a whole backdrop, because all of the governorships and the colonialists are Anglicans, and they look down on the Methodists, right? And so the Methodists end up being co-related with a lot of the indigenous groups because they're willing to go out there and work this. Anyway, it goes on and on and on. But the it's, when you say steal children, it's more monstrous what they're attempting to do, right? It's not that they're stealing the children, which is monstrous enough, but their pre-described idea for stealing the children is that the old culture is not of use to this child. We're going to anglicize them. We're going to colonialize them. We're going to make them in the kind of citizen that can go further and farther, right? In their way of thinking about it, and that process completely alienates them from their old group. So it's like taking someone, changing them psychologically, and then returning them to this group, and now they exist nowhere. They're not at home with the old group anymore because they missed the years of study of the traditional ways and traditional going about things. They're not really in this group either, and they're now this entity that has no home. So it's a terrible. This is a terrible history.
Yeah, we can certainly both agree on that.
Yeah, I'm just not sure that there is an actual reconciliation point. The actual solution should be peaceful coexistence between two systems that can't really engage with each other. That's my sense. You can't really take these land claims through the Canadian court system and come up with an answer that they go, oh great, it went through the Canadian court system. Thanks for that. I now respect.
I think we can both agree that there are people who are more expert than we are in this particular area.
We can definitely agree on that. And then the last one before my viewer questions is equity. Provincial anti-racism strategy, collect race-based data, introduce mandatory anti-oppression and anti-bias training for all public employees and legislators. Going to turn May 10th into Day of Anti-Asian Discrimination, and take urgent action to dismantle white supremacist groups in Ontario.
All of those things being very good. And I'll tell you a story about, you likely saw it in the news, but there was a time, and the Black Caucus of the Ontario NDP has been the driver of policies in this area, and us listening in that area is particularly important. But one of the things that I want to highlight is something that happened, it's probably 2 months ago now. There was a 4-year-old kindergarten child, Black child in Kitchener, who had a meltdown, had a whatever experience, and the result of that was that the school decided to call the police and brought a police officer to detain a 4-year-old child. That is not something that happens if that child is white. And that we don't know how many instances of systemic racism, how many instances of unconscious racism, all of the things that can occur, and the racism that people of color and Indigenous folks and people who don't look like you and me deal with on a daily basis until we start tracking that data in all of the different aspects of government. It is critically important that we have that data available so that we can start to understand what our biases are, what the systemically racist parts of our system are, and that we can track what improvements we are making against those.
As a side note, because I have kids in school, this is like the level of violence that's occurring in the classroom with kids uh, seems to be quite high.
Would certainly agree with that.
This is by no means limited to one racial group at all, and I think by population it would be, way more non BIPOC kids that would be by population because there's so many more. I don't know how to handle this, but I do know they've moved from a mode to go from going, okay, well, this kid is extreme is implementing violence, and I have a friend, and what are we talking about? This grade 4 class, the kid becomes agitated in the day, picks up desks, picks up chairs, starts throwing them. The solution is the kids go behind the teacher into the safe zone. They call they call the office. They send 4 ECs out. They sort of make a box around the kid. They put him in isolation. Because this kid is like going wild, right? And the parents come out and they deal with him, right? We have a current real problem that the people who are nobody wants to go in there and attempt to restrain this kid that's completely out of control, right? Because this is a messy. You're going to get bit. You're going to get kicked,
Sure.
and we have changed our previous solution with creating specialty schools that were designed for kids that are having this impulse control problem and putting them all into more environments designed to handle that, and said, hey, these kids need to remain in the community, right? Which I like, right? But it does seem to place teachers and educational professionals in a bind. I don't know the case to case on the 4-year-old. I don't know it well enough to comment on it, honestly, but I can see that you're getting more and more in schools where somebody wants to go, I'm not touching that kid. I'm not going in there. If I go in there and I restrain that kid, the story becomes, oh, now this ECE restrained this kid. You see what I'm saying?
But my point is that there is a racial component to making that decision. That the way the EPA thinks about it, if it's a black kid versus a white kid, is going to be different. And that we need training to understand that bias, and that we need data to understand that bias. That's my point.
I get your point, but the point is in this case, it could be very easily a reversal, right? So if somebody knows, hey, it's and nobody wants to interact with super violent white kids either. They
No, I'm like, and I have no idea the race of the child that your child deals with.
yeah,
But
not my child, but somebody else. But there has been previous grades where my kids have dealt with what seems to be off the scale violence, right? And the school is holding it. My point is, I'm not suggesting this is happening right now, but it is possible in my head that if the parents are known to the school board as someone who's going to complain about the handling of their child, if it's going to be this thing, they know there's going to be this big flap and this big investigation, right? That you could get what you're talking about, because people know that if the story is, I tried to settle this white kid down and there was some incident of biting and they got hurt and fell. Well, nothing will happen because it will just be assumed that I was acting, with good intentions. Whereas if it's a BIPOC, it will be assumed I was acting with negative intentions on some implicit bias, and therefore I'm going to get in trouble. Therefore,
I think you're proving my point that racial identity is a factor in these situations.
right.
That's my main point, is that understanding that whatever the bias is, there is a bias related to race in dealing with and like, this is just one example of it, but in every government system there are still biases related to race, and that needs to be, there needs to be training to understand those biases, and there needs to be data collected to understand how pervasive they are.
Yeah, I don't. I will say the one thing I do. I do think there's an interesting, like, I'm sure we can get data and pull out all sorts of ugly crap out of everything, right? I'm sure you can take people's weight. I'm sure you can take their height. You know what I mean? Heaven knows what you'll pull out if you start uh, um, mining statistical difference. And I do think the problem is once you have the statistical difference, just because you know that doesn't actually teach you which segment of the chain is at fault, right? So if you sit there and you say, well, in the top line in 25 years have,
Sure, but we've got
yeah,
people right now. Sorry, this is one I get
yeah,
very passionate about because it is a pervasive problem. Is that, sure, the data just quantifies, is there a problem? Doesn't tell you how to solve the problem. But right now, there are people who can just sit there and say, well, we don't have a problem. I treat everybody the same.
right.
There's no racial problem here. Until you have data that identifies there is a racial problem, people are able to ignore it.
Well,
We can
you
talk about solving it once we have the data that proves that there is a problem.
I'm not really sure that the only trouble with that is that I'm not really sure that once you have that data and you select there's a problem, right? You have such a pipeline because we're really only talking about like what the problem that we're referring to is only really sort of like university positions and positions where people make money, right? Like that's what we're focusing on. We're saying, hey, well, here's the, you know what I'm saying? No one's you. That's the thing you're trying to straighten out. You're not trying to straighten out.
I'm trying to get reporting on every instance of racism within the education system. I want to get reporting on every instance of racism within the correctional system. We want to make sure that there is far better accounting for instances of racism within government programs and services.
Yeah, I'm skeptical that when you have that data, okay, I think it's now, yes, something's at foot. Let's just agree that something is at foot, right? But what that something is, I think, is very difficult to pin down.
Even then, you've gone way further than what we've got today. There isn't that agreement today.
No, what you have today, and I appreciate this when you get into the anti-racism stuff in schools, which I'm skeptical of, is that what there's what you if you sit there and you say, hey, kids, you're all equal, you live in a multicultural society, you know, we've banished the boogeyman of racism, underground train, yay for us, right? When then some kid, then they all feel like you're not segregating them out, you're not separating them. But when one kid comes up and says, I've experienced this event, the other kids go, well, what are you talking about? Didn't you get back to stage one? Like stage one was live in a multicultural society where these things don't happen, right? So I am for the anti-racism in terms of getting the kids' minds to be open that these things are real. You see what I'm saying? I I am skeptical that people have solutions that strikes me as for sure make it better. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah.
But the more openly we talk about it, the more data we collect, and the more we do to educate people about biases that might exist, the better we're going to be.
Maybe. I'll take and
We can agree to disagree on this one. But
the only reason why I say maybe is because in the process, if you take the kids that are growing up like a blob, because everyone's growing up in this multiracial society, right? I tend to think the sheer process of them growing up together gets you 99.9% of the way there. The sheer process is they're all intermixed.
I do not believe you are correct at all. I think, and I think it is very, very dangerous for people who look like you and I to make that kind of assertion because we have that lived experience.
Well, I think that the lived experience of knowing and being friendly with someone who is in this other category at all ages the most powerful experience. That's what I would say. My kids have lots of friends of lots of races. They have not sorted them, into camps. They don't even, have this association. So I do think it's possible to go in there and say, "Oh, kids, you're not together. You're not all the same, right? Some of you are living some sort of completely different life in which the whole society has and will conspire against them. They're broken off. They're not like you, right? And just the same way as if I walked in there and said, "Hey, kids, here would be my corollary example. The kids are not aware of the fact that their parents have different incomes, right? So in Burlington, like I can go to a person's house that's $4 million and go, well, it's just a play date from the kids, right? But the kids don't walk into this $4 million house and go, oh my gosh, these people are doing way better than my parents. It's almost like they can't see it. You see what I'm saying? They're just like this is a nice house. This is a play date. I go to my house. I go to my play date. If you go in there and you say, hey, you know what? Some of you kids are super rich and some of you aren't. And some of you, I don't know that gets you to a better place. It could.
I, again, don't accept your premise. I think that kids are acutely aware of the rich kid got a dirt bike for Christmas and the poor kid got a doll.
At some age, I don't know what age it kicks in, but um, we're not about to tell them that one kid got the dirt bike and one kid got the doll. You're going to say, oh, one kid got the dirt bike, one kid got the doll, and that's because of inbuilt evil in the system and treachery of humans, right? Isn't that the or at best ignorance?
The point being that, I mean, and you and I are both approaching this from a place of privilege as well. Like, or I'm assuming for you, sorry. I certainly am, that I live an upper middle class life. My kids have had plenty of advantages in life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and listen, I am not opposed to any of the privilege argument. My problem with the privilege argument is that when somebody introduces the privilege argument, they then put circles around and say, okay, so these are the three circles I want to take. I want to take people in Ontario, and I want to drive one circle around the racial identity, the other circle around the other identity. And I go, hold on a second. I see what you've done there, but also the income of the parents is super important. They're going to work less hours. They're going to have more time with their kids. They have more resources to do things. There's this whole constellation of factors, and when you get into the privilege argument, people are like, I want to only focus on this one element, and I assume everything's driven off.
Here we can agree. There are a great number of things that give people privilege, and they can hit some boxes and not others, and people are impacted in very different ways. Fully appreciate.
Yeah. If you take people on the global level, for example, right? I say, so the most privilege you can possibly have is being English speaking, right? How do I say that? Because only 5% of people in the world speak English, man. 60% of the entire internet is written in English, right? Like the every program, this computer science program is basically almost an English blowout. There's way more books written in English than any other language. It's the privileges of privileges, English speaking. This is not to diminish uh, um, racial problems that we have in our society that I want worked out, right? But it is to sit there and go, uh, there's a whole constellation of things that people have got going for them, right? And everyone has some things going for them and some things that might not adopt to the culture, and not a maniacal focus on the idea that some people have no privilege. You see what I'm saying? And assuming, that some people have all the privilege. And I don't know that you can look at some white person and don't know that their dad was a meth head and their mom died of cancer when they were 3.
Racial identity is but one piece of this puzzle.
Yeah. And if you make it but one piece of the puzzle.
But the solution has to include all the pieces.
Yeah, listen, if you make it but one piece of the puzzle, I'm back on board with the general thing. Where I get off the board is when it becomes this not maniacal, but this focus on this one issue, and I go, okay, well, even if it have the solution. So here we got the last point on this, which would be the case in point is the Toronto school thing, right? because the trustees have just gotten this request to remove the trustees have gotten a request to take all entrance exams away from the specialty programs, right? So instead of testing kids for the specialty programs and then they do a cutoff, anybody who wants to go into any of the specialty programs will just be lotteried off.
I'm completely ignorant to this particular issue.
Well, this is the Toronto School Board thing. The question is because the reason why this comes up is because it did say remove all streaming from Ontario schools under the NDP platform.
Okay, fair enough. And remove all streaming.
Yeah, it's like no grade 9 advanced and basic math. The PC started this process for you last year, right? With the removal of grade 9 streaming.
Sure, but it wasn't to removing of grade 9 streaming. I mean, I'm assuming, sorry, you're catching me by surprise here, and it could be my ignorance about the platform, but I mean, there are university level courses are an important thing in grade 12.
Yeah, well, the argument becomes the problem with the streaming is showing up a racial disproportion, and therefore it's advantaging kids that were already advantaged. So if I sit there and I have a whatever I'm doing, and this goes from the arts program to whatever I'm doing, the person who happens to have the math skills or the acting skills is a product of a series of privileges. Therefore, if I install this barrier and say, I'm just going to take the best kids at math, I'm just going to take the best singers, I'm just going to take the best people in my athletics program, I'm reinforcing, I'm end gaming the privilege that got them here.
I can appreciate the theory. I apologize that I'm ignorant of the specific policy and can't effectively talk about it.
This is why I'm talking about the when I say I don't like the circles on the privilege argument, is that what happens is, because I'm called all the time if I just say, hey, I want school to be as challenging as possible for every kid. Don't care where they came from. I want every kid challenged at the maximal rate the school can achieve, right? And the reason why I say that is because my fear is if the public school fails to challenge the kids at a maximal level to whatever they can achieve, good news, there's a private school system that will. So although it's well intended to remove these systems from the public school system, I still think that if you, let's say your parents are have lesser means and you're a kid and you put your heads up and you say, I'm super interested in math, right? Well, if the public school system has decided not to have this advanced math system and not have advanced courses, then all kids of all races are just don't have that in the public system, right? But people with money can still have their kids tutored, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's why I don't like that policy. It's a well-meaning policy for your circle, but to me, it just once I take the circle one bigger, it's now become a negative policy. It's made sure the most challenging courses possible are only available to people with money, right?
I understand what you're going at, and I mean I'm coming close to tapping out for time here, but if we had more time, we could get into this.
I know. Sorry, I will do viewer questions and then allow you to go to your thing. So I picked the nice viewer questions that didn't have terrible insinuating things about your part of your platform. Should the election have a minority outcome, would you support a coalition with the Liberals?
I mean, this would be a decision for the entire caucus to make, and I mean, Andrea is the better person to ask that question to, for sure. I think the important thing right now is to make sure that Doug Ford doesn't form the next government, and that's what I am spending my time doing.
Yeah, I'm going to remove all the viewer questions that we already covered, which is like they're all housing, so you can throw like a lot of them. But here's the ones that are not housing. Do you really think it's appropriate to lower the voting age to 16?
Let's be clear, that one is a federal thing, not a provincial thing. So for distinction, that's not something we're fighting on in this election.
But you could take what's the Ontario voting age?
18. It is, the Ontario voting age is 18. Just the point is that Jagmeet Singh is talking about lowering it to 16 federally. There's no talk of lowering it to 16 provincially.
But it's hard to say. I have mixed feelings.
I think there is merit to discussing that for sure. That is like better youth engagement in politics and the understanding that there are certainly youth who have opinions, and if you're responsible enough to be able to drive, then you perhaps should be responsible enough to be able to vote. Like there is a conversation here. I don't want to commit to an opinion on it without having thought it through more. And when it becomes an issue,
Listen, I can't commit an opinion to it either, because on one level, I'm not excited. I mean, I'm opposite. Everyone's like, expand the franchise, no, I want to expand the franchise of people who are engaged and thinking about it and care. I don't I don't need to expand the franchise to 16-year-olds that are voting on the base of who they think is cool. You see what I'm saying? Now you're right. There's obviously some super keen 16-year-olds that we would definitely like their vote.
I think there are a whole lot of 35-year-olds who cast a vote without taking enough time to educate themselves as well.
Yeah, I'm not everyone vote. I'm not like everyone vote. It's great if everyone votes. I'm like, I want the engaged people to vote. But but I'm not like super excited about making it infinitely easy if all of a sudden it's just people hit A, B, C on their phone. I'm like, don't have that. Anyway, and so that was the last viewer question. So Andrew, what's next?
4 weeks of campaigning, and then we're hopefully we win. That's what it is. It's focused on getting to as many people as we can. We've been at the door since October. We have already got more, or by the end of tonight, we'll have more signs up in the riding than we did 4 years ago. It's really exciting what we're doing here, and next steps is driving that forward.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Greg, for having this opportunity. I really do appreciate this conversation. Had a really good time.
Thanks. Well, good luck.
All right. Thank you very much.